Great. Yes, we really appreciate the time that you've taken this midday to be with us in a very important event of the calendar of the South African Educational Research Association. The Nelson Mandela Legacy Lecture is normally held every year and is normally hosted by the institution that hosts our annual conference. This year, as all of you know, we have decided not to have a face-to-face conference. And in its place, the SAERA executive is hosting a number of webinars each month on issues associated with the SIG and the crisis condition of COVID-19. So in the same vein, what we have decided is that the executive of SAERA will host the annual Nelson Mandela Legacy Lecture. And with those brief words of welcome and explanation of the session, I'd like to hand over the session to Professor Linda Chisholm, who will be hosting this Nelson Mandela. She will give you more details about the lecture and why it's significant to us as SAERA. Over to you, Linda. You need to unmute.
Okay, so very briefly, something about the purpose of this lecture and something about Pam to introduce her. Okay, the purpose is linked to one of the aims of SAERA. One of the main aims of SAERA is to build a cohesive, inclusive, and a coherent education and research community. Now, part of what it wants to do through this legacy lecture is to contribute to this identity, to building this identity by providing a platform for people who have become very influential and made a substantial contribution to education. Mandela's memory, as we know, is most often invoked as a tranquilizing balm, as someone has put it, and mostly for feel-good and inspirational purposes. Now, what we do is we ask the speaker to go beyond this and to consider what would make Mandela educational as opposed to simply or just inspirational. How can we draw on his memory and his work, his legacy, to expose contradiction, to stimulate debate, and to provide conflict for the purposes of promoting deeper critical thinking? How do we say the name Mandela and in it find the points for questions about the things that matter in our lives, individually, as well as in the solidarities which we make and in our relationship with the wider universe? Now, I can't think of a better person than Pam Christie to address us this year. Pam needs very little introduction to educational circles in South Africa, and she is, one can say, a household name in them. She is Emeritus Professor in the School of Education at the University of Cape Town, and she's held positions at universities in both South Africa and Australia, including at Griffith, Wits, Queensland, Canberra, and UCT. These transcontinental connections and the dislocations associated with them, as well as and linked to her deep rootedness and enduring interest in South Africa, have given her a quite unique perspective on the questions that have for long and continue to trouble South African scholars. Now, the titles of her books also mark her as a person who has borne witness to and consistently engaged intellectually and with integrity with the extremely complex and difficult politics of education in South Africa. Let me just give you an example. They include, from 1985, The Right to Learn, in 1990, Open Schools, in 1999, edited with Jonathan Jansen, Changing Curriculum, Studies on Outcomes-Based Education in South Africa. In 2006, Teachers and Schooling Making a Difference, Productive Pedagogies, Assessment and Performance. In 2012, Reconciliation and Pedagogy, Post-Colonial Politics, and her latest, most prescient title and coruscating perspective on schooling in South Africa, Decolonizing Schools in South Africa, The Impossible Dream. These are a tiny measure of her extremely substantial contribution over the years to educational scholarship, which has incidentally also included quite a considerable corpus of work on educational leadership, something she has exemplified in everything she has done. I can't do adequate justice here to the full range of her accomplishments or to her CV. Suffice to say that it really gives me great pleasure to facilitate this session, and I now hand over to Pam to speak to us on the topic of Mandela's legacy after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb. Thanks. So over to you, Pam.
You need to unmute.
Unmute. I've just unmuted. You can hear me all. Excuse me, I need to do one more thing, which is to share my screen. Oh, I'm sharing my screen. There we go. I hope that you're seeing mainly my PowerPoints and not my everything else. Just let me see if I can get the view to. Yes. First of all, let me say it's a great privilege for me to be invited to give this lecture. And I want to thank the SAERA executive for for this invitation. I also want to thank Linda for her very generous comments. It's particularly significant to me that they come from Linda because we are colleagues of very many years of engagement, and I regard her as one of the finest academics in South Africa. So thank you, Linda. Now,
can you just expand your screen? Put it onto full screen.
I will put it onto full screen. Slideshow, full screen. There we go. That should be it. Back one. So I'll go again through the quote that I chose for the topic of this lecture, and because it gives a sense of the way in which I approached it. So thinking of Nelson Mandela as a person, as a political figure, as a global icon, he almost always made mention of education when he was articulating his vision of a free and just South Africa. There can be no doubt that he regarded education as central for the betterment of both the individual and the society more broadly. Yet, I argue, Mandela himself was not an educationist, and I think it would be fruitless for us to search through his legacy for a theory of education. Certainly, there are many aphorisms to serve as mottos for us as educators, one of them being that education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. But there is no Madiba magic to provide an easy solution to the challenges we face today as educators in present-day South Africa. So then, what does thinking with Mandela offer to us? And I suggest that it exhorts us to climb the hills that remain before us after the great hill that he himself has climbed. So in this lecture, I aim to open a conversation on what this might entail. I should say that I approach this lecture as being one of the generation whose lives were directly affected by Mandela, whose name was almost too dangerous. In fact, it was too dangerous to utter publicly in the period of anti-apartheid protests. The person whose freedom from imprisonment enabled him to be a leader in the negotiated settlement that ended apartheid, and we were all very much engaged in those times, whose global iconic status highlighted the moral victory in South Africa to replace its pariah status internationally. I never met Mandela personally, but I was in gatherings where he spoke, and I experienced his exceptional charisma. Mandela's presence has been woven through the activities and experiences of my lifetime. But I'm all too aware that the same cannot be true for the generations coming after mine, where Mandela's legacy will be reinterpreted and reshaped as it is weathered by time. So in what I'm going to do today, there are three main sections. First, I'll make some comments on these Mandela person, political figure, and global icon. That will take a little while. Then I'll move on to look at what Mandela's presidency achieved in negotiating change in schooling. So I'll switch to looking at the negotiated settlement in schooling. And then finally, I'll talk about the hills I think we still need to climb. I hope that there'll be lots of questions and discussions, because I don't think I'll be taking up 2 hours of talk. Okay, Mandela, the person, the political figure, and global icon. There can be no doubt that Mandela was a person of exceptional human qualities, assuming a mantle of leadership at different crucial points in the trajectory of political struggle. Words often mentioned are courageous, stubborn, determined, self-sacrificing, but also willful and dogmatic. But I suggest that Mandela, the person, was above all enigmatic and remains so. Not only is it difficult to extricate the historical person from his hero-leader persona, it is also the case that, as the historian Phil Bonner has noted, Mandela's story contains what he calls striking antinomies and contradictions. Those he names include the following: that with his chiefly heritage and law degree, and I'm going to show you, he straddled the traditional and the modern identities. He could be both flexible and intransigent, both consistent and impetuous. He placed his political commitments ahead of family and ahead of personal relationships. This is an issue he himself mentioned several times, but it remained unresolved. And while he submitted himself to ANC party discipline and often mentioned this, he also flouted it on key issues, such as the launch of the armed struggle in 1961 and his solitary decision in the late 1980s to begin negotiations, to begin discussions with the apartheid government in preparation for negotiations. I recall referring to Mandela in my own teaching on educational leadership in Australia in the early 2000s. Following Weber's classification of authority, I would point out that Mandela exercised all three types of Weber's ideal types: the traditional authority with his chiefly lineage, charismatic authority with his incredible capacity to draw people to follow him, and legal rational authority with his investiture as the first democratically elected state president of South Africa. In my teaching, I used a video recording of a speech he gave for the Sydney Olympics in 2000 called "What Makes a Champion?" And I used it not only to show the formal script where he stresses that leaders are part of a collective, but also a section where clearly off script, Mandela spoke about the tremendous self-control he was required to harness to bring himself to shake the hands of people he had every reason to despise, for his brain to dominate his emotions. To my great frustration in preparing this lecture, I found that the recording has not survived. All that remains is a formal transcript, which says nothing about dominating his emotions and mustering self-control to do what he felt was required of him. And I think this points to a larger issue in thinking with Mandela, that transcripts are not complete records, seldom capturing the spontaneous moments which could give the briefest glimpse of Mandela the person. And in my own experience, it is the off-script Mandela and his tone and gestures in moving off script that I remember most clearly. Much of what is recorded of Mandela's life and his writing is perhaps best understood as the careful crafting of a public figure. It is not surprising, therefore, that a number of scholars have noted Mandela's affable front but impenetrable reserve, and have speculated about the reasons for this, including his long period in prison and its effects. So a final observation about Mandela the man. When he was living in Houghton, Johannesburg, he would wander into Sacred Heart School in Observatory just to be with the children. If he had a bit of spare time, he would go and hang out with the children. This was the school where he filled in admission forms for his grandchildren, giving his name on the admission form as N.R. Mandela and his occupation as president. He would be remembered for joining a grade 2 parent meeting and asking if anyone minded if an old man like him sat on a proper chair instead of on the children's chairs. He was ever the charming presence, and those who were fortunate to mingle with him felt charmed. Mandela. Mandela. Mandela, the public political figure. Mandela will always be associated with the negotiated settlement that ended apartheid in 1994. Arguably, this was his greatest achievement, the great hill he climbed. Having been released from jail in 1990 after 27 years in prison, Mandela placed a strong emphasis on achieving reconciliation between erstwhile enemies. The unbanning of political organizations in 1990 launched a transition period of intense on and off negotiations, with violence always just there, erupting, subsiding, erupting, subsiding. In the course of negotiations, an interim constitution was drawn up as the basis for South Africa's first democratic elections to be held in 1994. A breathtaking moment for all South Africans who queued for hours with each other in a very solemn manner to vote together for the first time. Mandela was inaugurated as the country's first president, initially leading a government of national unity, which included F.W. de Klerk, the leader of the National Party. After 2 further years of negotiation, the final constitution with its Bill of Rights was adopted in 1996. Mandela's legacy will always be associated with this historical period, and how his legacy is judged over time will in part be dependent on how the achievements and limitations of the negotiated settlement are regarded. On this theme, a nuanced and probing literature is emerging with the passage of time, and Mandela's image, as well as the settlement of 1994, are being recalibrated. Notably, as Colin Bundy points out, a non-ANC Black intelligentsia and disaffected members of the born free generation, for those not South African, the generation born after 1994, these groups have produced counter-narratives in which Mandela is accused of selling out the interests of the Black majority in negotiations to appease the white minority. Moreover, scholars across a wide range of disciplines, including history, anthropology, jurisprudence, cultural studies, gender studies, and biography, are exploring Mandela's legacy and reassessing it. The chapters of the Cambridge Companion to Nelson Mandela that was published in 2014, illustrate the breadth and depth of this endeavor. A key issue debated in this volume and other work relates to the negotiated settlement itself, and the question of whether Mandela prioritized reconciliation over justice, particularly economic justice, or redistribution. Related to this is Mandela's relationship to big capital and the replacement of the Reconstruction and Development Plan, the RDP, growth through redistribution, with the neoliberally oriented gear strategy. Looking across these debates that are emerging, there is no doubt that Mandela's role as a political figure will be subject to continuing review and reconsideration, along with the historical period with which he is so strongly identified, which in itself speaks to his historical significance and also the importance of moving beyond romantic narratives of Madiba magic. Now, a few brief comments about Mandela, the global icon. Thomas Olesen, in his work on global iconography, suggests there are three intersecting elements that make up global icons: personal biography, agency, and audience. In the case of Mandela, his personal biography was actually whatever one can access of it publicly, remains. It was taken up through the agency of the anti-apartheid movement and the ANC within South Africa, and it was enlarged through its resonance with an audience in globally ascendant values of democracy and human rights. So Mandela himself, the agency of the political movements within South Africa, amplified in the audience beyond South Africa, and of course the actors beyond South Africa as well. But Olsen also argues that iconicity involves a form of oversimplification, a reduction to basic features that become detached from social conditions on the ground. In becoming an icon, Mandela as person and as political figure is simultaneously magnified and rendered superficial. Moreover, as Elike Burma points out in her writing on Mandela and his image, I quote, "The meanings of any icon are tethered to its history." In Mandela's case, this is to the anti-apartheid struggle and the global endorsements of human rights. But she notes further, the cultural prestige of South Africa has receded relative to its 1990s high point, and its cultural aura is now more in keeping with its status as a middle-ranking nation within the global South. So that is Mandela, Mandela, the person, the political figure, and the global icon. Now, in raising these comments that I just have about Mandela, my intention is not in any way to diminish his significance or contribution, but rather to historicize it and to lay the basis for the central argument that I'm making here, which is that instead of searching for Madiba magic or a theory of education, in his contribution, we should think with him and take his own words seriously, that climbing one hill opens the vista that there are many more hills to be climbed. That's a metaphor or an image that has a lot of meaning for me. I think often of having climbed a hill and only to realize I wasn't at the top. But in saying that Mandela didn't have a theory of education, I'm not saying that he said nothing about education or that there's nothing that education theorists can draw on in their work, in thinking with Mandela. So from looking across his work, I myself find several key themes that have bearing on education. That he considered schools in a wider social and economic context. They were always part of something else bigger. That he regarded them as key social institutions linked to social development, skills formation, and the eradication of poverty. And particularly in speeches to young people and to teachers, and if you look at the events he spoke, the transcripts of events and so on, he spoke of important values in education, the importance of respect and discipline, including self-discipline, the importance of listening to others, the importance of recognizing that rights are accompanied by responsibilities, and the absolute need to make the most of all opportunities. There can be no doubt that he attached great importance to education, particularly in his fight for human dignity and equal rights and the eradication of poverty. What then did he leave us, moving on to the second of my themes, his legacy in education? I'm just going to go back forward. Yes. Let me say a couple of points first. Mandela formed a government of national unity that included a range of different people from different political perspectives. Arguably, he did not appoint a very good person to head the Ministry of Education, particularly as regards competence in schooling. Sibusiso Bengu was in higher education, his Director General, Tlanyi Manganye, also from higher education. Countering Minister Bengu was Deputy Minister from the National Party, Renier Skuman, who certainly knew a lot about schooling. So I think one of the first things I'd want to say is that schooling per se did not enjoy great benefits from a special glow or special focus by Mandela. Now that's a contentious point. I hope somebody will disagree with me. But in the course of the 1990s, from 1990 when the political parties were unbanned and negotiation processes began, through to the period when of the formation of the Government of National Unity, the adoption of the final constitution, and Mandela's years after that, the organizational design of the schooling system was fundamentally changed. And it was changed, just summing up, most of the South African audience would know these points, but they're a good reference point for what I'm going to say next. First of all, there was the constitution that was adopted in 1996, the final constitution, which provided the ground rules for all policies. And it is notable that the significant education policies were only confirmed after the adoption of the constitution. The formal adoption of the constitution was when they were formally legislated. So the constitution itself stipulates in its preamble the rule of law. It stipulates the values of human dignity, equality, advancement of human rights, non-racism, non-sexism, and education as a basic right. This is a fundamentally different picture to apartheid, a completely different basis of design of the system, different identities for citizenship instead of the fragmented so-called racial and other identities ensconced in education departments under apartheid. So that was the ground rules. One of the first and early steps that had to be taken was to rearrange the departments in law, because this was a negotiated transition. It wasn't a takeover of the state. So the National Education Policy Act, which was finalized in 1996, collapsed the racially based departments and replaced them with new national and provincial departments, 9 provincial departments instead of the previous 4. and all the former homeland departments collapsed into these new geographic arrangements. Very importantly, the South African Schools Act of 1996, SASA, introduced a strongly decentralized form of school-based management, and it also enabled schools to charge fees to supplement state funding. The National Norms and Standards for School Funding introduced a quintile system going from the poorest schools to the least poor, first in the provinces and then across the country. And having divided the schools into these quintiles, it provided for what I consider anyway to be a relatively small portion of the budget to be allocated on equity principles, so that the poorest schools would get considerably more than the least poor schools of a smallish pot, and only to be used for what were called non-recurrent purposes, that is, not for staffing. Now, I'll come back to the significance of that later. The Education and Labour Relations Council was established to regulate, so that all teachers were to be treated equally instead of the previous apartheid system. Qualifications, salary, conditions of work, and so on are regulated by the ELRC. And then, of course, there's curriculum changes, Curriculum 2005, that replaced the apartheid curriculum with OBE, and other changes as well. And just because of time, I'm going to concentrate on this organizational design, or as Aslam Fatah says, with those of us who have a sort of a neo-Marxist and other background tend to focus on provisioning and structures, you know. Maybe that's not entirely true, but I'm focusing on provisioning. The point is that South Africa, under Mandela, did establish a single non-racial schooling system with a mantra of sameness. The same norms and standards for all schools set by the national department, the same governance arrangements for all schools, the same teacher qualifications and remuneration, the same curriculum. However, this doesn't mean it has not translated into the same experiences for all schools and all students. And there's general agreement that the education system is very unequal and performs dismally. South Africa actually ranks among the worst performers on all international comparative scales. I'm no great fan of international comparative testing, but it is noteworthy that South Africa has managed to come last. Somebody has to come last. When it improves, and we hear great accolades about high levels of improvement, but we forget how small the base is that it improves from. So it remains very bad. But more to the point, the system shows two different patterns of performance on all forms of testing, which is termed bimodal. And I've given a little graph there to show what a bimodal performance looks like. What actually happens is that some students achieve very poorly and other students achieve very well, and they form into patterns. The minority of students attending the fee-paying public and private schools achieve good results. These are the former white-only schools that now also serve a new Black elite. Nearly 80% of the students attend the poorly functioning part of the bimodal system. Almost all the poorly performing schools are Black schools in rural areas and townships. The results, when analyzed, differ according to poverty levels and according to former apartheid departments of the schools. So there is a distinctive historical geography in these performance patterns, which leads me to suggest that the apartheid template of schooling is still visible. Former white schools, which I find very ironically called Model C schools, and I'll tell you why just now, stand on one end of the spectrum of privilege and performance, and former Bantustan schools at the very other end, and rural and township schools towards that end, towards the 80%ers. So if we've got to the top of the hill that Mandela climbed and has given us the system, and we pause to reflect, we need to ask, why have these inequalities persisted so many years after the formal dismantling of apartheid? So I'm suggesting that before we attempt to climb the hills before us, it's valuable to reflect rigorously on where we went wrong in the design of the new system, so that changes we may make target appropriate issues. It's also important to recognize where we went right and try and build on that. In terms of the achievements, I think we really do see in the transition and the post-apartheid government a massive shift away from a racially organized and structurally unequal provision to one of a formally non-racial and single system for all. This is no small achievement. But having said that, the ministry and the new appointees from the left, from the mass liberation democratic movement, I should say, those appointees, new appointees in the department, had limited expertise in schooling. So we were really at a disadvantage as a country. We had former, the old members of the previous department blending in with new political appointees, and in that mix, it was quite difficult to find a way around a lot of issues. Moreover, we have a very cumbersome bureaucracy, and we have a complex division of powers between national and provincial departments. Hence, all of the debates around who is responsible for the delivery of textbooks and so on, and why, where the money comes, what grants it comes from in Treasury, and how it gets directed, and why we still have 3,900 schools with no water at this point in time. Now, I think to look at some of the reasons why we have what we have, we need to go back to the negotiation process itself and recognize that the design of the system that we have is a product of a very tough and compromising negotiation process, where the teams negotiating the future espoused different values and visions, and they pressed very hard for what they wanted. Now, I think that there were three issues that strike me, and there are more too, but I'm just picking up three at the moment in my emphasis on provisioning. I think there are some unresolved challenges or some tensions that have been papered over that have been too difficult for us to unpack, and on which we have built a system which we would have to pull back on, and that's complex. Now, the first, I think, real product of the negotiation process is what happened to the former white schools. Now, I argue that at the very beginning of political change in 1990, the Minister of Education, Piet Klaaser, introduced the so-called Klaaser models to all white schools. There were three models. I won't go into the details of them, but you can look them up. I'm sure some people know them very well. Model A, Model B, Model C. And in 1992, he declared all schools, all white schools, to be Model C schools. Now, Model C schools were schools that could, had very strong governing parent councils that could run them up to within very strict national apartheid department regulations. They were able to admit students of other races, provided they remained 50% plus one white, and provided they kept the ethos of white schooling going. And at the same time, they would have to raise some funds for themselves and become state-aided schools. Now, there's reasons for that, and we can go into them in the question time if anybody wants to ask. But the point is that well before the negotiations actually happened, the white schools were ring-fenced in a way. They were provided for, because in the negotiations themselves, the National Party and others held very strongly onto the rights of those governing bodies of those white schools to be negotiated with rather than simply changed and absorbed into a common system. So they were protected during the constitutional negotiations, and it's section 247 of the interim constitution said that they could only be changed with bona fide negotiations with their governing bodies. So that set them in a ring-fenced position. What I didn't really know until some of my more recent research was just how bitter the struggle was over what schools' language policies could be in the new system. I didn't know, for example, or I was unaware, that education was one of 3 clauses that were holding up the adoption of the new constitution in 1996. That in fact it was about land, labor lockout laws, and medium of instruction in schools. And the agreement was reached literally 2 hours or so before the final deadline for the final constitution. And the bitter struggle was whether there could be single medium public schools, namely Afrikaans schools. It was fine if they were private schools, perhaps, but would there be public schools that could look much as they did before? It was a very bitter fight, if you want to see some of the strong language that was used on both sides. And finally, ironically, it was the Democratic Party that came up with a compromise clause that said that they would not be precluded from receiving funding. And the National Party, in fact, voted against the adoption of the South African Schools Act. But what I'm suggesting is that the status of former white schools was not negotiated along with all schools. They were already established as able to have students of different, not white racial classifications. It was already established that they would have strong management committees and that they would raise some of the funding for themselves, but on the understanding in the classer models that they would keep their existing ethos. Now, why do we call former white schools Model C schools? I mean, it's very ironic because that's exactly what these schools are, I think. They are Model Cs. They're not the normal public school, but the privileged ring-fenced section of it. Okay, that's my first point, and I'd be very happy to take comment and debate on that. The second point, which I think was not fully resolved, was the powers given to school governing bodies. Now, both sides in the negotiation process favored giving extensive powers to school governing bodies, but they did so for different reasons. For the ANC and the negotiators on that side of the table, school governing bodies represented the democracy that had been part of the struggle in schooling during the period of, during the anti-apartheid struggles from the 1970s onwards. There had been an aspiration that schools would be emblems of democracy, and school governing bodies would be democratic. They would involve parents, they would involve students, and that was the vision. For the other side, for the National Party, these governing bodies were to be the Model C type governing bodies. They were to be the governing bodies that could ensure that the rights of the schools were maintained according to the South African Schools Act, and their notions of, I mean, it is quite striking to see the differences. As people have written about school governing bodies in the post-apartheid period, you can see a number of people assuming that public schools are not state schools, and that that governing bodies should actually have considerable powers. In fact, some of the schools would really quite like not to have any subsidy from the government, because then they could operate, although on state premises or former state premises, as private schools. But the governing bodies of the poorer schools, on the other hand, are governing bodies that don't have the same kinds of resources. They don't have the financial resources. They don't know how the system works in the same way as the privileged schools with their governing bodies of lawyers and accountants and so on and so on. So the governing bodies issue is a debatable one. I myself have always felt too much power was given to governing bodies, and people have contested that, have disagreed with me on that. So you're welcome to debate that point too. I think perhaps most importantly though, as the third point, funding inequalities were structured into the system right from the beginning. Why do I say that? First of all, fees, allowing schools to charge fees, means that those schools classified quintile 5, the least poor schools in the system, have been able to raise fees to supplement their staffing and learning opportunities to a remarkable degree. They can actually double their staff complement from what the state gives them. They are able, through so-called governing body positions, to double their staff. So that means that their class sizes are reduced, their subject offerings are increased, and generally the levels of provisioning are much greater than would be possible if they only had to survive on state subsidies. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, nearly 70% of public schools are fee-free. Now, it used to be just quintile 1, i.e. 20%, then moved to quintile 2, quintile 3, and now some of quintile 4 are declared by the government to be fee-free schools, which basically means that they are located in communities that are too poor to pay fees. Now, the funding, what I wanted to say, the national norms and standards for school funding, which you'll see as dot point 4, is supposed to be actually giving that equity funding to the poorer schools, and it does. But the amount of equity funding that these schools get is a fraction of what is available to the Model C, so-called form of white fee charging schools. Now, just to give you a little bit of actual information on this, and then I won't give so much kind of detail, but just from the Statistics South Africa's General Household Survey of 2017 points out that 67.2% of students attended schools where no fees were levied, and a further 6% paid fees of less than 100 Rand, which is tantamount to no fees, to fee-free schooling, according to Stats SA. But what I found really very interesting in this is the breakdown of no-fee schools that shows the influence of historical geography. So Limpopo and the Eastern Cape, Limpopo has 92% of no-fee schools, and Eastern Cape, 78% of its schools are no-fee schools. The Western Cape, 47%, Gauteng, 51%. So you can see a very big regional difference in the distribution of wealth and poverty there. Another indicator of poverty is school feeding, which provides a similar spatial pattern. 91% of students in Limpopo, 90% in the Eastern Cape, and 88% in Mpumalanga rely on school feeding. 54% in the Western Cape, 55% in Gauteng. And then just a final comment on the equity points, that the equity funding formula gives 1,390, 1,390 per student in quintiles 1 to 3, half of that in quintiles 4, and 241 per student in quintile 5. Now, of course, it may look like a big difference between quintile 1 and quintile 5, but if you consider that in 2017, the census estimates were on average 9,000 per student in fees, you can see that the extra 9,000 per student is a lot more than what the equity funding formula allows. And public schools charge enormous fees. And I think my colleague Sarah Black mentioned something around 40,000 Rand per annum, and I think Sarah can correct me on that later on. So there is a fee disparity, or there is a financial disparity that is built into the system. And the disparity is such that large numbers of people are in the poorer, fee-free section of the system, and a small proportion in the fee section. And that disparity actually affects the experiences of schooling. It affects the class sizes. It affects what subjects are on offer, who teaches what subjects, and a lot more than that. So I think there are real questions to ask about whether the system can meet its goals. In SASA, the preamble states, this country requires a new national system for schools which will redress past injustices in educational provision, provide an education of progressively high quality for all learners, and in so doing lay a strong foundation for the development of all our people's talents and capabilities, advance the democratic transformation, combat race, sex, etc., etc. And you can see all Mandela speak in that, all Mandela speak. But I really question whether the redesigned system can redress past injustices as it stands. And I really question whether all public schools will be able to progress. Are they on the route towards the same quality of education as provided in the well-performing parts of the system? Or will high quality mean different things for different parts of the system? Now, in my book that Linda mentioned, I make the argument that the basic design of the post-apartheid schooling system has limited capacity to redress apartheid injustices, to overcome the deep inequalities between schools, or provide equal quality for all in terms of experiences and outcomes. That's my excoriating critique. So, viewing the hills ahead, what do we see from where we stand? We see that South Africa is trapped in cycles of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. Inequality is greater than it was under apartheid, poverty is extreme, and the labor market is not really functioning very well in relation to, in particular, women, young people, Black people, rural people. So there are structural features of the post-apartheid dispensation, and schooling folds into this. But I don't think that it means that this is the best schooling that we could possibly have under these circumstances. And I'll come back to that in a moment. But conditions, structural conditions, are very dire. The majority of schools are Black schools in poor communities where African languages are spoken. The performance of these schools relative to their privileged counterparts has remained fundamentally unequal over the years. I think it is highly significant that African languages are not supported in the formal schooling system beyond grade 4, or the transition in grade 4 to the medium of instruction being English or Afrikaans. And so there's no textbooks and policies provided for languages other than English and Afrikaans, which massively disadvantages the majority of our children, I would argue. And again, it's a point that people might want to pick up on, and particularly I'll then hand over to my colleagues from the Boer Lit Collective, who are working for translanguaging in schools. I think that the historical geography and power dynamics of apartheid and colonialism have not shifted. I think the curriculum as designed does not support the majority of students. The content and pacing, now this is controversial. I know many people are very committed to the curriculum in its current form, and they would strongly disagree with what I'm about to say. But I believe that the content and pacing do not match the conditions of the majority of schools. I think it is a curriculum of coloniality, which isn't based in local conditions. Now, which I'm not suggesting that we so-called drop standards, so much as I'm suggesting we look carefully at what standards we actually provide, which I think for most people are fairly dismal. So I've said a number of these points before, and I won't repeat them, except to say that if we think that the system as it's currently structured is going to deliver the goals that we're promised or that we envisage, I think that this is a myth of progress. And I think it's distracting us from the important tasks of repair and rebuilding. So finally, thinking with Mandela, I thought I would find a couple of those aphorisms that I said could guide us. So Mandela says, education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. And there can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. So I think that if we want to tackle these hills ahead, in the spirit of saying, as soon as you climb one hill, there will be more, there will be more, I think we need to acknowledge that we've got problems with the current system, that we haven't arrived. I think it's got to be a starting point, not to assume that we're on track, without pausing at least to reconsider. I think we should review our current practices, the current funding, curriculum and language policies, and be willing to change them as needed. This will be extremely difficult, but I think it needs to be done, at least to be reviewed. I think we should acknowledge that apartheid did damage. It was not just an unequal distribution of resources, it actually did damage, and it requires more repair than we are currently providing. I think we need to develop policies that suit the majority of the schools towards changes that value these schools, that value all the children and the teachers in these schools. And I think that we need to work our policies backwards from these existing conditions rather than imposing an ideal notion that we can't achieve. I believe that there are always possibilities for change that must be explored. And in saying this, I'm going to pick up two more of Mandela's aphorisms as I close. Mandela says, one cannot be prepared for something while secretly believing it will not happen. So if we secretly believe that this change can't happen, we can't be prepared for it. And finally, victory has demonstrated that no person anywhere in the world should not dare to dream of wanting to change the world for a better place. So I dream of it.
What's 3.5 times 5?
It's 1 hour. That's it. Pardon?
Oh, no, I'm being, no, in a percentage. It doesn't matter, I'll just put 3.5.
Richard, I think you need to mute yourself. Pam, thank you very much. That was exactly what we expected. Deep analysis of the enduring questions. Why have these inequalities persisted and what can we do about them? You've raised some fascinating questions. I think there are probably many people who want to ask questions and engage. I know that there are some There are some questions in the chat, but we've agreed between Melanie, Lucky, and myself that I will take the hands that come up and that she will collect the questions in the chat and then submit them to you after we've had a couple of questions from the audience. So I don't see any hands. I don't know if that's because my system isn't really working, but I really would like to welcome anyone who would like to ask a question to feel free. Shireen Matala has raised a hand. Shireen, go ahead.
She'll have to unmute.
Shireen, just unmute yourself.
I have unmuted.
Okay.
Hear me? Well, this feels like being back in the corridors of WITS and the three of us seeing each other. But thanks, Pam. That was excellent Mandela lecture, and as part of SAERA as well. I'm very grateful for you for taking this opportunity. I just wanted to raise one issue about the points you made. I thought it was an excellent presentation. And it was related to your comment about Model C. I think we've just done some more work on it recently, and I think what we're seeing within the schooling sector is a much more complex typology of inequality to schools. So within schools, there are vast shifts and movements going on, and there's a much more disaggregated or nuanced picture of what's going on in the schooling system. So simply, the traditional Model C schools have seen a huge white flight out of them, being replaced by deracialized middle class. There's another category of Model C schools which are now becoming, which are now sort of low-cost fee-paying schools, which are closer to the private schools in that grouping. So yeah, there's much more movement that has gone on. So I think one needs to understand that a little more clearly in order to know where we go to from there. I just wanted to say about the issue of funding. I saw a comment in the chat, and I think you're absolutely right in your observations that while that the vast majority of our children, 60 or 70%, are trapped in the no fee schools against a backdrop of huge structural inequality, which exacerbates the picture. And I really do think the point you made is absolutely correct, that it is time to review the two main funding instruments, which is the school funding norms and the equitable shares formula, both of which have used categories of poverty to determine the levels of funding. But I think given that things have changed, we do need to review those. Yeah. Thanks very much.
I don't see any other hands. So Pam, do respond if you want.
Can I just,
Yeah.
sorry,
Yeah, sure.
There was also
Okay.
Esther, who asked about any attempts have been made to change the funding formula. So in line with Shireen Mutala's engagement, if you could just talk about any attempts that have been made.
I'll just make one comment, and then in fact, I'll turn back to Shireen about the funding ones. The Model Cs, of course, are much more complex. I think I was taking a historical perspective in terms of saying how how certain fees and fee charging schools were able to continue. But I think in my book, I do actually acknowledge this work of Mark Hunter in Durban schools, for example, is very interesting in showing the markets within Model C schools. I think that Johannesburg situation is very different from the Cape Town one, with which I have become a bit more familiar. And perhaps I was emphasizing too much what I saw there. But the point I didn't make and should have made is that what's happened is that as schools take the government to court, so we get decisions made on the basis made by the judiciary that in fact I believe should not, it's not the province of the judiciary to make policies or decide on policies for schooling, as I think the third generation social rights debates show. But as to the questions about funding and where there have been attempts, I mean, I think actually Shireen is much, I mean, I have to just acknowledge, I mean, Shireen's expertise in equity and funding and all of these issues is absolutely long-standing and stellar. So Shireen is the one to speak.
Shireen, do you want to respond? Otherwise, there are a number of questions in the chat that Melanie could perhaps put to you.
No, not much more than what Pam has said already. That basically, and you know, I remember the work of Firoz Patel and acknowledge his work in this area, but
yes,
very little review has happened in terms of the two major funding formulas in the last 10 years. It's almost as though issues related to funding and schooling have gone on the back burner as issues of funding in higher education have taken center stage. But thanks very much. Thanks, Pam. That was great. Thanks.
Melanie, do you want to collect the questions from the chat?
Sorry, Melanie has been kicked out, so I'm filling in.
Okay, good.
Okay.
All right.
So there's 3 questions, I think, that seems to be playing out. There is a contestation about linking content to coloniality, and this is the question raised by Craig. So perhaps some comments on the link between the content of what we teach in schools and coloniality. There is also the issue around the curriculum and language. And it's about the, just let me get back to that. How is the curriculum and language policy change envisaged? Any idea about, you know, what is being thought about in terms of that? Another question by Esther was about, but white flight from predominantly Black Model C schools still does nothing to improve the lot of the majority of quintile 1, 2, and 3 schools. And maybe I also want to add my comment there is when we begin to talk about quintile rankings, quintile 1, 2, 3 schools should by now have disappeared from the face in terms of development rather than just from a funding perspective. And there's a question by, a comment by Maureen Robinson. In the context of what is being said here, how do we motivate enthusiastic young student teachers to feel that as educators, they can make a difference to society and other lives? Is this a pipe dream? Is this a pipe dream? Or an our part? Pam?
I don't know if anybody in the audience here, is Cara McKinney in the audience still? She might have had to leave. I saw Cara earlier. Is I don't know if anybody else on the language. Caro, I'm relying on you to answer these language questions.
Thanks for that. Well, I think that we need a change in the language policy. I mean, that's what you've said, and that we need to be able to use African languages beyond grade 3. And that doesn't just mean informally through code switching and translanguaging in the classroom. It actually means having bilingual materials, being able to write assessments in languages other than English, and to support the bilingualism of our students, because you can't get through to matric without being at least at minimum bilingual in South Africa. You've got to have your own language as well as English. So we know that, but we treat our students as if they are English monolinguals from grade 4 onwards, and then can't understand why they struggle so much with assessments. So the practical work that has to be done, in fact, I don't think we actually even need a major change of the 1997 language in education policy, because that policy makes provision for bilingual and multilingual instruction. So it's not really even about a major change in policy. It's more about supporting schools to implement that policy, producing multilingual materials, training our teachers for multilingual education, and changing our assessments so that they're not monolingual. Even similarly to how English and Afrikaans bilingual schools had exams in both languages that should be something that's available to all our matric learners and in fact lower down the system. I mean, I could go on about this, but I'm just giving a few little ideas. I'm going to stop. Thank you, Pam.
No, thank you. I am an affiliate of the Boerlit language group, so I never want to miss an opportunity to support the language work, even although I myself don't know very much about language. I want to pick up on the, let me just make a kind of a quick comment to Maureen. I think that how do we motivate people or young teachers? All of the research shows that, well, the sociological research shows that the largest influence on students' life chances is their home background. But within schools, the largest influence is the teacher. So I think we have to give young people this recognition that in every school, under all conditions, teachers can make a difference, singly and collectively. My own work on resilient schools and on the Schools That Work report, it is always possible for teachers to make a difference. And I can talk more and more about that, but that's a kind of more of a motivational comment, but it's also a research-based one. About the coloniality issue, I think in South Africa, we have not had a proper curriculum debate, or not for a very long time. And I'm going to be controversial here, and I hope to be very, I hope not to offend anybody in saying this. But we have got into a very interesting and rather unique curriculum side stream, very strongly influenced by notions by the work done by Basil Bernstein, whom I respect, but I am not a follower. But we have developed a very particular notion, which is very different from the curriculum in Australia, the curriculum in the States, whatever it is, and the curriculum in the UK. We have developed a notion that there is a difference between powerful knowledge and everyday knowledge. And the people who do this tend to trivialize the everyday knowledge into ridiculous things without recognizing how much everyday knowledge there is in that is very important to us, like and everyday knowledge is how to operate a bank account and what compound interest may mean. This is not disciplinary knowledge that you're going to learn in history or maths. So what I'm saying is I think that there's been a trivialization of the everyday. Now, of course, we've got OBE in our legacy, and that was disastrous in many ways. My own view is that OBE failed in the first instance because it was not accompanied by a proper curriculum, National Institute of Curriculum Development, which was supposed to be there in the first place. Nobody in the earliest days argued that there should be no syllabus. But the notion that you can have powerful knowledge as knowledge, and that the majority of people are not taught in a way that they get that knowledge, how can that possibly be a curriculum success? That, in my mind, to my mind, is a curriculum failure. If you go into ordinary schools in rural areas, my deep research in the town of Carnarvon in the Northern Cape, you will see the pacing that does not suit the context. You will see that the materials are not there, resourced in the same way. They refer to life experiences in the workbooks and things that have got nothing to do with people who live in these kinds of places. It might look as if it's powerful knowledge, but that should not ever be a term that's captured by any one particular group of thinking. Powerful knowledge, all good knowledge is powerful knowledge. I'm strongly in favor of disciplines, but I don't think disciplinary knowledge is the only form of knowledge that we could have. And I think if we go into coloniality, the argument there is that the argument of the decolonial theorists of Latin America in particular would be that what we have done is not, that let me start again, that the Western episteme is one that has come to be universalized. Its universalizing principles are taken as the only ones. Whereas in fact, we have a much more pluriversal experience in the world. The idea that only the sort of metropolitan knowledges of the West are the valuable knowledges is a mistake, because and it doesn't mean that we should throw them away, not at all. We shouldn't discard the Western episteme. Rather, the point is to begin with where we are and to develop the knowledge that builds the best quality of life and human value from where we are. And that means taking our languages, taking our conditions, taking the Western, taking everything, and working with that to develop a more decolonial approach in our curriculum. Now, it sounds incredibly radical, but there are some very simple first steps. You know, I mean, working at UCT, for example, with the Faculty of Engineering, simply to say the examples that you use in your class don't have to be about surfboards. You know, it's that kind of thing where we start. We start in the recognition that all knowledge is situated, and working from that in a complex project, build from where we are. But this is a very garbled, I fear, response to what's a complicated question. And I'd like rather to refer you to some of the writing of Carolyn McKinney and myself, and also where I explore some of this in my book.
There are a couple more questions in the chat on curriculum and language, but I think you've really addressed that quite comprehensively. We could come back to them, but I think there are two other questions that I think I'll just throw in that also come from the chat. The one is about standards, and it was, I found your views on standards and its attainability given the varying contexts interesting. How do we change this? And then another one from Michael Samuel. If the source of the challenges largely emanate from historical, sociological, systemic, and econometric political issues, are the levers for deep change to be found outside of the educational sphere? This is simply to acknowledge that it is not educationists alone who can resolve our country's challenges. How do we establish this kind of joined up thinking? And I just want to piggyback on that one. You mentioned in your talk, when you were talking about why the inequalities are persisting, that one of the issues was that during the 1990s, there was no expertise on schooling in the educational system. Now, I want to just kind of challenge you a little bit on that, because I think that people like Michael, John Samuel, even Trevor Coombe, there were a number of people in the system who did have knowledge of schooling. Wasn't it the type of knowledge of schooling that was not amenable to the newer, wider trends and neoliberal patterns that were taking root, that were at issue? It was not the knowledge of schools as contextually situated and shaped that was valued. It was another kind of knowledge about schools being, how to make schools more effective and so on. So, I mean, I wonder if you could say something about that related to what Michael Samuel has said.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the questions. I think that the point, Michael, is absolutely correct. I think once upon a time we used to imagine that education could change society. That was the kind of 70s, 80s possibilitarian days. Then we got into a kind of a more reproductive framework where education could do nothing. Now, I think both of those are not helpful. That binary is not helpful. I think there are always things that can be done, but I think I think you talk, and I see in your chat about levers for deep change. I think absolutely it isn't educationists alone, But I think we ourselves have got to find these levers, and I don't think we have been focused on trying to find them. We've been focused on other things, but I think we need more of a priority to look at things like where these points of change may be, and who to bring in to do them. I think there's quite a lot of dispersed expertise. And I think I love your question, and I think it's up to all of us to work together to try to grapple with some of these issues, recognize the obstacles and move ahead. Linda, expertise on schooling. I mean schooling, and I think that John Samuel was, as I remember him, was an adult educator. And Trevor Coombe, as I remember him, was a university professor who came across. So I think they were very good people, but I don't think there was anybody I think there were two people, as I recall it, who had that deep knowledge of education. One of them was Ken Harley. He knew about schools from having been in curriculum committees, and Oberholzer, a couple of the people in KZN. And Peter Buckland, who actually worked in administration. But for the rest of us, we talked about schooling, we cared about schooling, but it was very difficult to do any research in white schooling for people of our political persuasion. I mean, to get into the schools, to do the work was extremely difficult. In fact, I think we were very, very, I mean, I think in my recollection is that the people in the NECC and so on were parents, we had one prominent educationist who was a pharmacist, chemist, and so on and so on. I mean, they had education that, you know, very prominently and understood systems maybe, but I don't think people knew how to run a school. Neil McGurk. People who were involved in the transition. I don't know, it would be an interesting debate to take further.
Okay.
I don't know, do you disagree?
I think it's something that can, you know, that needs a bit more.
Let me frame it differently then. I think, let me say it this way. I think we were outweighed by the expertise that existed in the previous system around schooling specifically, as opposed to adult education, labor unions, etc. I think there was an enormous amount of expertise held by other people, by the old order rather than the new. That's all I'm really saying.
Okay. There must be other questions. If not, let me ask another one. I mean, this question of language, around the politics of language, is so interesting, both around the white schools and around African languages in schools. Just to stick with the former for a bit, I mean, this is an issue. I mean, the politics of negotiation that you were talking about, that's an issue that goes back centuries. But what's interesting, actually, at the moment is that I mean, I don't know about the research that has been done about this. It's merely kind of anecdotal on my part. But at the same time, I mean, what you're seeing now perhaps is still a desire on the part of Afrikaans-speaking parents to have their children speaking Afrikaans. But so many of them are actually now thoroughly bilingual and have adopted English. So, I mean, I'm just wondering if those ties are weakening, or if you know anything about what's happening around that, because I think the dynamics there are pretty complex as well, that might have to do with the middle classization, what Jonathan Hislop calls the middle classing of the Afrikaner community, where some issues just became much less strong than they were before. But I don't know. I mean, do you or anyone else know about the dynamics around Afrikaans in the schools at the moment? Somebody did raise in the chat the question of uniforms and discipline linked to language and how these are all related. And but yeah, so I just wondered if you could, I'm trying to find that, and then we could, school discipline also needs to be decolonized. Language policies and problematic hair policies are wrapped up in school codes of conduct. uniform, while argued as a big equalizer, upholds gender stereotypes and are a fossil of the militarization of secondary schooling from the Napoleonic Wars. Wonderful.
Love it.
So anyway, I mean, okay, 2 participants have raised their hands, so you don't necessarily have to answer my questions, but it's just something that I wanted to throw in about the complexity of the picture. But those people who had their hands up, I can't see your hands, but why don't you unmute yourselves and please ask your question.
Hi, this is Renelle. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. I raised my hand. And it's a question I asked in the chat, but I want to repeat it. And it's not a critical comment, but a genuine ignorance on my part. So I understand that you were saying that the negotiated settlement built in these structural inequalities. But what I don't understand is the process of curriculum formation. What did we do wrong there? And sort of also from a historical point of view, who were or who are the influences and what vested interests are built into our curriculum? Or is it genuinely, can we just all write it off to ignorance? I'd like your comment. Thank you.
I'm going to do 2 things, if I may. First, just comment on language directly in relation to Linda, and then I'm actually going to ask Linda, with her curriculum hat on, Linda, to answer the questions about what the first curriculum and what went wrong and all of that. So I'm just forewarning you, but first I'm going to just comment about the Afrikanerization and so on. I mean, the middle classing. I think my experiences or my comments have been saturated by the work I did in Carnarvon, where what I encountered was an extreme version of what I'm talking about. Namely, the school, Hoërskool Carnarvon, was a Model C school, and it operated in the white part of the town, and across the dry riverbed in Bonteheuvel was a coloured school. Now that coloured school had been purpose-built as a secondary school in 1984. In 1989, the primary school, which had been located in the town for coloured students, burnt down. And all of the children were moved from Anstark, were moved across from the town onto the same premises as the high school. So you had this massively overcrowded school, 2 lots of bells ringing, 2 lots of staff and so on, and overflowing toilets. Model C school across the river in the town. Come 1997, and the South African Schools Act being implemented, the white school refused to be restructured. Refused to be restructured, took the government to court along with other schools and managed to stave off until 2007 the amalgamation of that school, knowing how dire the circumstances were just across the riverbed where the 2 schools were operating on one set of premises. The Schools Act was amended, and over a weekend the schools were restructured. So the teacher literally, as the term began, all the high school kids were taken to the school in the town, and all the primary school kids were shipped across, and the teachers. So the teachers took their posters off the walls and went across the river to the other school. It was as dire as that, with which all of the white parents took their kids out of the school. So
and then just to build in Renelle's question there, and so what difference did curriculum change make in that context? What did curriculum change, OBE and the subsequent revisions actually mean?
I'll tell you. What struck me was because I did a bit of historical research into the Western Cape Department of Education archives and that language, those language debates of the 1800s that you're talking about, which are absolutely fascinating because they could have been written for today. What struck me very, very powerfully in the history of this town was that for that community, the language was important yet, but it wasn't yet quite as important. What was incredibly important was a particular ethos, a particular notion of childhood, a particular notion of koshuis, moeders en vaders, koshuis ouers, that how you wanted your children to be brought up, the respect, and that was still something that was mentioned in the town, 2 or so years ago when I was last there, with people saying they would send their kids to the support center where they knew there were mistakes in the maths that was taught. The maths teacher in the primary school said this, and she gave the example of where the maths teacher was wrong when teaching her child. And she said, but I don't mind. And other people saying, it's more important that our children are brought up in our way of life. So there's a deep cultural conservatism that gets attached to language. And I suspect it's embedded deeply within the church. And where those ties loosen, so other things will loosen too. But one of the things that strikes me in talking about South Africa is just how different all the places are. So different in the Northern Cape, so different in the Western Cape or Cape Town itself, and so on. For a school like the Carnarvon schools, curriculum 2005 would have made almost no difference. Those teachers would have been able to say, we are able to teach what we want to do, so we'll just go on as we were. It actually let those schools continue because they had the resources, they were teaching the same kinds of students they had before with a lot more freedom. That's my impression. But Linda, you would know this, so I really want to ask you from the review perspective, what sorts of issues were coming up?
There's a huge literature on this. I'm not going to take up the space that you have, Pam. So I'll duck out of that one for now. But there was another hand up, and I think that person should ask a question. And while you're unmuting.
It would be Carol Bertram. Can I ask?
Yes,
Thanks so much. Thank you, Pam, for such a fascinating engagement. I wanted to just ask you to elaborate a bit on one of the bullets you had on your final slide, which was about the damage that apartheid has done, and how, I can't remember if you said exactly, how do schools need to engage with that? And I was just wondering if you could, we know that, the damage.
You've just muted yourself again. Just unmute yourself, Carol.
So just the question about exactly what you were meaning about how schools can engage with that, the damage that apartheid has inflicted. Are you thinking more around kind of psychological identity issues, or, I was just interested if you could expand a little bit more on that point, Pam.
Okay, I think there's a lot that, and taking Linda's lead, I won't go into too much detail on this, but I think that implicit in a lot of this is a kind of a racism and what it is like to feel that racism, to feel always inferior and so on. But I think the most powerful expression of that, if you just give me 1 minute, is in fact in Ngugi on language. I won't be a second. Let me just, let me read you this quote. I think it's very easy for people who have always been in dominant positions to feel that there's no need to, excuse me for 1 second. I really do want to get you this quote because it's of the work of Ngugi on language, which I think sums this up. I'm just reading in my, checking in my book. Okay, this is Ngugi talking about language. When people or anybody alienates you from your own language, it is a kind of an alienation from many things. First, from the knowledge carried by that language. So the knowledge of the area, the trees, the rivers, whatever, gone. Second, from the history of the community that made that language, gone. For a language, it takes many years, hundreds of years to be where it is. So that external power completely whips out like a hurricane, like a bomb that comes and clears everything that was there, and it tries to plant something else on this terrain or contaminated ground. Now, I think we don't actually adequately recognize those kinds, and it's not just language, but it's the being of people. Ngugi goes on and he says, language is more than a means of communication. It is also a carrier of culture and meaning, quote, mediating between me and my own self, between my own self and other selves, between me and nature. So I think we have done a lot of, whether one wants to call that psychological, I don't know. I think we don't realize the damage, and I'm using language in the broadest to apply also to knowledges and cultures and things. I think the standardization of the one way of doing things has caused a lot of damage. I think it still is.
Pam, there's quite a big comment here from Anne Hickling-Hudson. And I want to make the comment, or whether I shall just read it.
Ask Anne to make it if she's still here. I don't know if Anne is.
She's still here.
I'm still here.
Yes.
Oh, Anne, make it yourself. It's lovely to hear you.
Hi, Pam. Thank you for that excellent analysis. Well, my comment said was that really it can apply to schooling in most post-colonial countries, because there's that huge bimodal disparity with the, 80% going to the poorly performing schools, and the privileged schools are only a minority. But it's very difficult to see how radical change can take place in that situation, because policy making is dominated by people who don't have any commitment to radical change. The changes that I have seen in the Caribbean tinker at the edges of reform, and they do put in place some reforms, but it's certainly, a world away from an equitable system. Can you imagine them advocating funding equity or a decolonized curriculum that recognizes the epistemes of our societies? And so my question is, how can we get to that kind of change? It would take a wider change in the society and politics to enable radical school change. So it's how we get there I'm interested in. For example, that point you make about languages. Most people, with a privileged education background are just not interested in the work that it takes to move the curriculum forward to include languages other than English and, the dominating languages. They're just not interested in doing it. So how do you move to that change?
I'm happy to respond to Anne directly in this way. First of all, I think it is really important to keep holding to keep holding the flag, as it were, or to keep pressing ahead and not to give up in envisaging things to be different. I absolutely agree that it takes changes beyond the school to bring changes within the school. But Anne, if I may say, Anne has had Anne's late brother, Fred Hickling, psychiatrist, has done amazing work breaking the bounds, even if at the edges, in Jamaica, in post-colonial framing. So I would want to throw back to Anne to say, how did Freddie do it?
Yeah, well, that's an inspiring question, which I'll have to think about.
But the thing is, we've got to keep the inspiration going. We've got to keep working for something better than what we have. And I just have one good suggestion. I think if if all of the universities required competence in an African language for admission, it would in one fell swoop advantage the disadvantaged and disadvantage the advantaged. How about that? That's a thought.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And another idea that I've had is that, you know, if the privileged schools were required to share their privilege with nearby schools that are poorly performing, or you know, the fee-paying schools are required to share their privilege with state schools, then that would be a step forward, but I just can't see it happening. Like, they could share, you know, their better qualified teachers, their excellent libraries, their swimming pool. They could share those things, but nobody asks them to.
Yeah.
There's some wonderful comments in the chat. And there's one more that I think we should take up because it relates to this curriculum question. I've been told that we need to bring this to a close quite soon, but Leslie Lagrange has asked, and I don't know, Leslie, if you want to unmute yourself and perhaps expand on it. He says, why are we surprised that Curriculum 2005, the National Curriculum Statement, and CAPS have done nothing to change things in schools? Do you want to elaborate on that, Leslie? Or do you want to answer, Pam?
No, I want Leslie to elaborate. It would be wonderful to hear his own answer to the question.
Sounds like he's gone.
Well,
okay, I'm here.
There he is. There he is.
Good, Leslie.
So I didn't intend to answer, you know, to answer my own question, but I mean, for the reasons that the previous speaker has obviously mentioned, that we should ask the question about what schools can do and what they're able to achieve if there's not broader change within the society. But I think the entire approach to curriculum and all of these frameworks basically ignore, I mean, decades of work that have been done in the field of curriculum studies.
Exactly.
And so, I mean, we can pick up on what that is, but there's no time to actually to do that. And of course, there's the work that Jonathan has done that the intention wasn't necessary to bring about substantive change in his work on the politics or the symbolism, political symbolism. But I mean, all of these approaches, they all are based on Tyler's rationale. So fundamentally, nothing has changed, even after Joseph Schwab's statement that curriculum is moribund and his notion of the importance of the practical and deliberation to solve curriculum problems. But if one uses a transcendent way of thinking about things, that's something that we're going to produce outside of the practices of education, and that's somehow going to bring some change, is highly problematic for a number of reasons. It's Newtonian in its approach. As soon as you apply that kind of approach, you obviously will create something called a policy practice gap. Because if policy is not a practice-based activity, then of course it is going to be problematic. But it's a complex debate, and there's a complex answer, and I can go into a lot of detail, but obviously there's not time for that.
Thanks. I've been asked.
Yeah, wonderful to hear that response. Thank you, Leslie.
Yes, and I've been asked to bring this to a close. So, Pam, I want to turn back to you and ask for some concluding remarks, if you want to make any, and then I'll ask Labby to close the session. But just to thank you very much from my perspective for having agreed to this after, I know, quite a grueling few other sessions as well. So.
No, just in conclusion then to say thank you, Linda and SAERA. I really I really appreciate being invited. It's an honor for me to be able to speak to this group of colleagues. So thank you for that. I think we've had a very broad-ranging discussion, but if I could say anything, it's how exciting it is to think about breaking some of these boundaries and talking further, and keeping alive the sense that there are things to do, and we need to work together collegially to, I don't want to use a cliche, but just to walk, to make the path we walk. You know, we have to actually be always pressing. In a Foucauldian sense, you know, liberation is never achieved. We have always got to be pushing against the fractures and stresses to get conditions that are more acceptable than they are. So I don't know that we'll ever get a total change, but we will definitely be able to get things better than they are. I believe that firmly. So thank you all to the colleagues for being part of this, and thanks to Linda and SAERA.
Thank you. Labby, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pam and Linda, for doing the session. I think it was a fantastic session that has generated so much of engagement, and we really appreciate it. So on behalf of SAERA, I'd really like to thank you all for continuing the work of SAERA. More importantly, we'd like you and we'll invite you to be the family of SAERA and to use the platform to pursue and continue with educational research for inspiration and influence. And we really like to keep the conversations going. And I think with the lockdown that has come to us suddenly, we've created new opportunities for communication, and we must exploit the digital platform that's available to us and form communities of practice around particular issues that we think is important for us to engage. And the more engaged that we are, that we will be able to instill greater interest in making change for the country itself. So what we've also done as part of SAERA is to create or upgrade our webpage to be more interactive, to capture a lot of the activities that we do as a research association. But more importantly, more recently, we've actually established the SAERA YouTube channel. And this video recording will be part of that channel. But to also use the opportunities that are available through the channel as well as the web page to create communities of practice so that people can form groups that they can communicate and engage with particular aspects as a way of influencing the country and scholars in research. So we are creating platforms for engagement. We want you as members of SAERA and outside of SAERA to exploit these platforms and engage with us. But thank you very much for an inspirational chat. And I think, as Linda indicated, this is exactly what we needed from the Nelson Mandela Legacy Lecture. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Linda?
Thank you, and bye, everyone.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye, and
Bye.
thank you, Pam.
Thank you, Pam.
Thanks for that wonderful session.